right, John chapter 4. So, by way of introduction, I'd like everybody to keep in mind how really early we are in Jesus' ministry. This is really the very opening of Jesus' ministry, which I think really enhances what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks. What we've seen so far is both Jesus and John the Witness, kind of back and forth between the two of them, preaching, teaching, baptizing, calling disciples, and making rather deep theological and important statements. And we've seen this through a series of conversations between Jesus and one between John and various individuals or small groups of people. So I want to go back through this and see it from the viewpoint of conversations. The first action was John's proclamation of Jesus as the Lamb of God, which directly led to Andrew and John the Apostle leaving, following Jesus, and spending all night with him, having a rather intimate conversation and time with Jesus. And that led directly to an intimate conversation between Jesus and Peter when Andrew brought Peter to Jesus. So Jesus leaves there, heads back to Galilee. Along the way, he stops and calls Philip to follow him. That action leads directly to an intimate conversation between Jesus and Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew. Next, we see Jesus at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, where he turns water into wine and has a very intimate, pointed discussion with his mother. After this, we see Jesus in Jerusalem, where he runs those buying and selling in the temple out, which led to a pointed yet intimate conversation between Jesus and some of the ruling Jews at the temple. Next, we see Jesus stays in Jerusalem for the Passover feast, performs multiple signs, but he does not fully reveal himself. Those actions directly lead to a rather intimate conversation outside of town with a member of the ruling Sanhedrin, Nicodemus. Jesus then sets up shop in Judea, preaching and baptizing. This leads to an intimate conversation between John the Witness and some of his disciples, which is what we looked at last week. So Jesus' entire ministry thus far has been a series of actions that lead to intimate conversations. If I were to liken Jesus to something, at this point it might be a perfectly cut, flawless, brilliant diamond. And each of these conversations shines a light on a different facet of that jewel. And each facet shows us a little better how truly glorious Jesus is as we gain a deeper understanding of who he is and why he has come. We're about to dive into an event which will lead to 3 additional intimate encounters and conversations with Jesus. The first will be a conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. This will be followed immediately by a conversation between Jesus and his disciples, which will be followed immediately by a rather intimate 2-day encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan people at Sychar. For Jesus to continue to have this kind of interaction with anyone is going to become increasingly more difficult as he begins to really perform miracles, as he begins to really speak out, as he begins to really preach the gospel. He's going to draw people from everywhere. And most of them are going to be looky-loos who come because Jesus is feeding people and performing miracles because people love bread and circuses. Feed me and entertain me. So this really is a very special and unique period in Jesus' ministry. And there's an awful lot in here. Oh my goodness. I mean, all that we got out of his conversation with Nicodemus, it's going to be like that again here. So I want to read this whole passage, and I'm going to do that each week, but we're not going to get that far. But with good reason. This is going to be slightly an enhanced version of the way I teach. So we'll see what you think afterwards. John chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But he needed to go through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. The woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us a well, and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this well will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water I shall give them will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have well said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am." And at this point his disciples came, and they marveled that he talked with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking to her?" The woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, "Come see a man who told me all things I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" Then they went out of the city and came to him. In the meantime his disciples urged him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat which you do not know." Therefore the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him anything to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to finish his work. Do you not say that there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I have sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. And many of the Samaritans of the city believed in him, because of the word of the woman who testified, he told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with him. And he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his own word. Then they said to the woman, now we believe, not because of what you said, for we ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world.
I feel like I'm like, that's awesome.
That is awesome.
Father, this word is awesome because you're awesome, because you are absolutely breathtakingly beautiful and amazing. And as this word that you wrote, that you inspired, that you protected and preserved and passed down to us over all this time, as we look deeper into it, it just becomes more and more and more obvious how. I wish I had a better word than amazing, but amazing you really are. Father, do it again tonight. Let us dig into your word, and let us just see again how truly amazing you are. Let our hearts just be moved with the brilliance of your radiance, of your glory, of your beauty. Lord, help me to glorify you and lift up your people. And all this I ask in the beautiful and blessed name of Jesus. Amen. So, starting at verse 1 through verse 3. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. So I'm going to start by taking verses 1 and 3 together because they go together. Verse 2 is kind of an aside, this the brackets, and I'll come back to that. So Jesus, as we mentioned earlier, had set up shop. He was preaching and baptizing, just like John the Witness, somewhere within Judea. I think what this verse is telling us is that Jesus literally stuck around just long enough so the Pharisees would find out that he was gaining a bigger follower than John the Witness. Once he knew. Therefore, when the Lord knew, it's almost as if he was waiting for that. That was the whole point of the exercise. Why would Jesus leave at this point or wait for this point? The best answer that I can see, which actually brings up more questions, is that continuing to minister in Judea would cast a shadow over the movement that the Spirit had begun through John. Perhaps it would have even eventually completely delegitimized everything that John had done, because, John didn't, we got the Jesus dude, and so he heads out of town. Why do I think that? That therefore, at the beginning of the verse, directly connects what Jesus is doing here to the previous events. When a Jew had approached John's disciples, wanting to know, hey, what's the deal? How come everybody's going to you and going to Jesus? So the therefore shows a direct cause and effect link. This happened. Jesus knew this, left town. The Jews had actually started what amounted to a dispute between John and his disciples. And what we see happening, I believe the text completely supports the assertion that it could have served to delegitimize John's ministry. I even get the sense from the flow of things that Jesus was anticipating and waiting for this to happen. But that leads me to ask a question. If that is enough of a concern for Jesus to leave at this point, then why did he start teaching in Judea at all? I mean, if he knew it was going to cause a problem, but God has a plan. Had Jesus not started preaching and baptizing in Judea, we would not have had the conversation that happened between John and his disciples. God is sovereign in everything he does. And he wanted the conversation between John and his disciples to happen for the benefit of those who heard it, and so that it could be written down, recorded, and preserved for us 2,000 years later. In that conversation, we saw Jesus as the bridegroom, a facet of Jesus that we had not previously seen. It is an important aspect of who Jesus is and why he came. And God set all of these things in motion to get one conversation so that we would have it 2,000 years later. Verse 2, which I skipped. Though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. Jesus did not baptize. It doesn't tell us directly. But let me build a case here why I think Jesus didn't baptize. Inevitably, someone at some point would make the case that Jesus' baptism was superior to everybody else's baptism. And we actually start to see an echo of that in the previous passage in the discussion between John and his disciples. But it also actually became an issue in the early church. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 1:11 through 15. For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos. No, I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I had baptized in my own name. Jesus knew. God knew that there's something in the heart of man, a desire even in spiritual things to somehow feel superior to everybody else. So he just didn't baptize. Verse 4. And this is where it gets really interesting. But he needed to go through Samaria. Samaria and or the Samaritan people actually figure rather prominently in the New Testament. It's mentioned in at least two stories, and one of probably the very best known parables. Even non-Christians know the parable of the Good Samaritan. Mm-hmm. So we're going to dig into Samaria and the Samaritan people, a history, some background, and in it there's just some amazing stuff. So for a little while here, we're going to go history. 930 BC, Solomon dies and Rehoboam takes the throne. At this point, the 10 northern tribes approach Rehoboam and request tax relief in return for a pledge of allegiance to the new king. Solomon had instituted heavy taxes to help pay for the temple and his throne, his palace, and the people are like, okay, you're a new king, why don't you throw us a bone and we will fall in line behind you. Rehoboam was an idiot, and he said no. Rehoboam rejects their request in 1 Kings 12:14. The 10 northern tribes then declared independence. They had actually only very reluctantly joined with Judea and Benjamin. Under David, David had to, take Jerusalem and actually be in power for quite some time before they swore allegiance to him and united all 12 of the tribes under David. So it was really no surprise that they were the first to jump out. 1 Kings 12:16 tells us about that. The 10 northern tribes made Jeroboam the first their king in 1 Kings 12:20. They retain the name Israel. The two remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin, become the southern kingdom, taking the name of the larger tribe of Judah. Jeroboam, now king of the north, Jeroboam I, institutes a worship of golden calves in Bethel and Dan in an effort to consolidate his power. If the people went back to Jerusalem, they might feel old, soft-hearted feelings towards being part of a bigger kingdom and turn on him. So he led them astray. We see that in 1 Kings 27, 1 Kings, I think 16 or 17, 27. I'm sorry, I wrote that down wrong. 885 BC, Omari takes the throne of Israel. 1 Kings 16:16. During the 6th year of his reign, he buys a hill in the land of West Manasseh and builds a city on it. He names this new city Samaria, and it becomes the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. We see that in 1 Kings 16:24. Under Omri's son, King Ahab, Samaria became the religious center. The city of Samaria became the religious center of the northern kingdom after marrying Jezebel, who was a Phoenician, and instituted the worship of Baal and Asherah, while continuing calf worship that had been instituted by Jeroboam I. The northern kingdom lasted 212 years. It had 19 different kings, and not a single solitary one of them ever did what was right in the eyes of God. In 725 BC, the king of Assyria lays siege to Samaria, taking the city finally in 722 BC. This is 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6. Now Assyria had this interesting way of maintaining control over conquered lands. They figured that they would keep people off kilter and dependent on them. So when they took over a territory, they would round everybody up and haul them to another part of their kingdom, preferably a conquered area. And then they would take people from other conquered areas, uproot them, and plant them in the area that they had just conquered. This left people bewildered, confused, and dependent on Assyria. The Babylonians will actually do something very similar to this, only with a bit more aplomb and are a bit more successful with it. Now the surviving people of the northern kingdom were rounded up, moved by Assyria, and placed in Halah by the harbor, and I'm not sure exactly which harbor that is, a harbor in Assyria, perhaps near Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, by the river Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. That's recorded in 1 Kings 17:6. But they didn't take everybody. They left behind what most people would call the dregs of society. The poor, the infirmed, the lower class, the sick, the diseased, the outsiders. They took anybody that they thought was worth having and moved them and left behind the very lower echelons of Jewish society. Now these people in Samaria, in this conquered territory, they were replaced by people from Babylon. So these are Chaldeans, modern day Iraqis. And I know I'm going to butcher this. Kutath, C-U-T-H-A-H, and I should have got on there and figured out how to pronounce that. And I bet I thought I knew how last night, but today I can't. This is a city near Babylon that would make these people also Chaldeans. Ava, Hamath, which is from a city in Upper Syria, and here I go again, Sepharvim, which is also a city in Syria. So they moved out all the Jews, and they moved in Syrians and Iraqis. A really odd thing happened to these poor relocated people, and that is recorded in 2 Kings 17, 25 through 33. And it was so at the beginning of their dwelling there that they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, Yahweh sent lions, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, "The nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and indeed they are killing them. They do not know, because they do not know the rituals of the God of the land." Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, "Send there one of the priests whom you brought from here. Let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land." Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear Yahweh. However, every nation continued to make gods of its own, and put them in the shrines on the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities where they dwelt. The man of Babylon made Succoth, Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Sepharvites burned their children in fire to Adramelech and you know what, it really doesn't bother me that I can't pronounce these guys' names. So they feared Yahweh, and from every class they anointed for themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. They feared Yahweh, yet served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. So these people then intermarried with the ethnic Jews who were left behind. And out of that, we get a mixed race people known as today Samaritans, who kept the rituals of Yahweh out of superstition, but obviously had no true reverence for Yahweh because they continued to serve the gods they had worshipped in the lands that they had come from. 597 BC, Babylon overruns Judah, and part of the people are carried away into captivity. 586 BC, Babylon sacks Jerusalem, destroys the temple of Yahweh, and most of what was left of Judah is carried into captivity in Babylon. 530, jump way ahead, 538 BC, Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, decrees that the Jews may return to Judah. 537 BC, two groups of exiles return to Judah. 536 BC, the temple altar is rebuilt and construction of the second temple in Jerusalem begins. The temple was completed in 516 BC, exactly 70 years from when the temple was destroyed. It's crazy. So it's during the rebuilding of the temple that the Samaritans approached the returned exiles. This is recorded in Ezra 4:1-3. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we seek your God as you, and we have sacrificed to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel said to them, "You may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to Yahweh, God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." Now, personally, I'm not convinced that this was the proper response. I don't know why, and it's not recorded that they made any attempt. Wouldn't this have been the perfect opportunity to say, hey, you weren't trained properly, you weren't taught properly, you have to walk away from these other gods. You want to come and truly serve and follow Yahweh with us? Come on, but you got to leave the other stuff behind. You got to walk away from it. You actually have some Jewish blood, so on some level we're brothers. But that's not what happened. The Jews had been judged by God for their constantly turning to idolatry, constantly walking away from God and worshiping the gods of the people that God had wiped out. That makes so much sense. But the captivity had really cured the Jews of their idolatry. And in an effort, probably a good-hearted effort, to prevent a return to idolatry, they completely insulated themselves. They turned totally and completely inward. And I'm sure I know this had noble intentions, but this failed to take into account God's intent to make Israel a light to the whole world. And if they're going to be a light to the whole world, why wouldn't they start with their half-brothers? And this wasn't the way it was in the olden days. Think of when the temple was built and Solomon was reigning. The people came from all over the world to see the temple, and they were let in. They couldn't go in, but I mean, they were let. Come and see, come and see, come and see, come and see. And many of them took the one true God with them throughout the world. People were converted, and they're taking an exact opposite approach here. And it's going to lead to some real problems. Probably the most well-known of the dignitaries, the Queen of Sheba. Almost all commentators believe she left being a convert. She left being a worshiper of the one true God. This out-of-hand rejection of the Samaritans led to open hostility between the two peoples. They constantly tried to oppose the building of the temple, then the rebuilding of the walls. There was kidnappings and murders and open hostilities and plans to kill the leaders, and it got very ugly. Eventually, the Samaritans supported the invasion of Alexander the Great, and as a reward were granted permission by him to construct a temple to Yahweh of their own on top of Mount Gerizim. They claimed that Moses had actually directed that the temple of God was to be built on Mount Gerizim and not in Jerusalem. We're going to get into this more. In fact, it actually really figures in later. The blessings and curses, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and Gerizim was the Mount of Blessings. And this was possible because the Samaritans only had a slightly corrupted version of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't have Chronicles and Samuel and Judges and all the books where God tells David, yeah, I picked Jerusalem, build your temple here. So there was this constant argument as to who had the true place of worship. And when they did hear about the rest of the Holy Scriptures, most of it's Jewish history, and so they just out of hand rejected it. The Jewish policy of separation and isolation continued and grew. I believe it reached its zenith after the Maccabean revolt, and I didn't have time to get dates on this. The newly independent Jewish nation eventually conquered Samaria and destroyed the Samaritans' temple to Yahweh on Mount Gerizim. It was at the beginning of the reign of the Hasmonean kings, after the Maccabean revolt, that the Pharisee and Sadducee sects of Judaism were both born. This is the seed of that. Despite their theological differences, they agreed upon one thing: complete and utter separation from all non-Jewish people. Absolutely get away. Pharisees and Sadducees alike loathed and hated Gentiles. It went double for the half-breed and heretical Samaritans, who had been such a thorn in their side. After Rome took over the land of Israel from the Greeks, Samaria was reduced to a province or district, which eventually came under the control of Herod the Great. After his death, it came under the control of his son Herod Archelaus, who controlled it for a whopping 9 years. Herod Archelaus was deposed by Rome, and Samaria and Judea came under the direct control of Rome through prefects. The prefect in charge of Judea and Samaria at the time of Jesus' ministry was Pontius Pilate. Animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans continued even under Roman occupation. After Judea and Samaria came under direct Roman rule, the capital of the 2 provinces was moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima, which was located in the province of Samaria. The move added significantly to the Jews' hatred of everything Samaritan. Jews hated Samaritans in general, and devout Jews thought that any contact with Samaritans made them ceremonially unclean. In fact, the word Samaritan became a derogatory term on the level of what we would, of the N-word today. If it was used against that, it was on that level. And in fact, it was used that way against Jesus. In John 8:48, then the Jews answered and said to him, "Do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?"
Oh.
They weren't fooling around. Verse 3 told us that Jesus was in Judea and was headed for Galilee. Now this verse tells us that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. What does that mean? Does this mean it was the only way to get from Judea to Galilee? No, absolutely not.
Quite not.
And last week I said we did a kind of a primer on geography and where things were laid out, and this week it plays huge, to the point that I printed up some little maps for everybody. I don't have enough for everybody, but if you share, there should be enough to go around. It's not exactly, yeah, we got it, you got it.
Oh,
One here. You guys can share, I think.
Yeah.
At this point, we should be able to, I would think. All right. So, Jesus is up here, down here actually, in Judea. Samaria runs kind of along this line. Because they were both under direct Roman control, they colored them in the same because this is the political lines, and that's pretty much how it is in there, correct? Samaria and Judea run together.
Yes.
But the line kind of runs through here. So Jesus is in Judea, and Samaria, Galilee's up here. It was the most direct route, but it was not the only route. As a rule, good Jews avoided going through Samaria at all costs. If you had the money, you could hop a boat in Joppa and sail around and get off anywhere in Phoenicia, and it's just a hop, skip, and a jump into Galilee. And many did go that way. But what most Jews did was cross over from Judea into Perea, go up along the Jordan River, into the Decapolis, and then cut over into Galilee.
This is high, and this is high, and this is high.
Not only did the Jews avoid going through the land of the filthy, heretical, half-breed Samaritans on general principle, they also stayed away because the animosity between the Jews and Samaritans had made it dangerous for Jews to travel through Samaria. Flavius Josephus records in his Antiquities of the Jews that Galileans traveling through Samaria to Jerusalem had been murdered. This caused such an uproar between the Jews and Samaritans that Rome was forced to step in and separate them.
Wow.
So the route Jesus is taking is neither the safest nor the socially acceptable way to get from Judah to Galilee. Yet, Jesus needed to go that way. Verses 5 and 6. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. I didn't get these maps till just before, and they actually kind of counter something I'm going to say. So the map's wrong.
There's a whole lot of abouts and uncertainties on here. So
Yes, and that's what it is. Jesus needed to go through Samaria, and so he did. And they came to a place called Sychar. There's actually a lot of speculation as to the exact location of a city in Samaria called Sychar, despite the fact that I printed out a map that directly contradicts that by putting Sychar in the map. Sychar was probably smaller than the dot that they actually used, so that's inaccurate on its face value. So some have thought that the spelling was incorrect, that it was perhaps a scribal error when they were copying the New Testament. They've since found more than enough copies with the exact identical spelling to completely disprove that. It was spelled Sychar. A few have tried to say the name was a colloquialism or a slur. It got turned into a name. Sychar can mean drunkard or something along the lines idiot, and so they thought maybe it was a slur that had gotten turned into the name of the city. That theory is a huge stretch and really not plausible. The fact is they do not have an archaeological site as of yet that allows them to say with certainty exactly where this city was. Yet. And that's the awesome thing about Israel is somebody will be digging up a swimming pool, digging a hole for a swimming pool, and will find the Ark of the
They're gonna
Covenant.
dig up
So
Jacob's well.
Right.
you just don't know.
There you go.
They could find it tomorrow. It's
Yeah.
out there. It exists. They'll find it if God wants them to, whenever.
Yeah.
But the awesome part is there is a second landmark given. The actual scene where this narrative takes place, or the narrative we're going to look at next week, the location of which is absolutely positively not in dispute. Jacob's well. And that landmark is actually far more significant to the story than the city it's near. Jacob was a nomad, as we know. He moved with his family and flocks all over the land of Canaan. There's another map with lines all over it, all the places that Jacob moved with his family. He dug wells wherever he settled for any period of time that there was not already one dug or a natural source of water, or a spring or something. So many wells could be called Jacob's well. But there is a second piece of information that we can hone in on. As a nomad, Jacob did not own any of the land that he worked, that he ran his flocks on. And the promised land was never actually transferred by God to Jacob. It was promised to his descendants. They still had to go to Egypt, spend 400 years, get smacked around, and then come back. It was promised to his descendants. So what piece of land could Jacob give to his son, beloved, favorite son, Joseph? Actually, upon entering the land of Canaan after escaping his uncle Laban and surviving a reunion with his brother Esau, Jacob actually purchased a piece of land just outside the city of Shechem. Genesis 33:18 and 19. Then Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, which is where his uncle Laban's place was, and he pitched his tent before the city, and he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And somehow he transfers this land directly to his son Joseph, and it's recorded in Joshua 24:32, not the transfer, but that it was Joseph's. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem, in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. It was on this piece of land outside of Shechem that Jacob dug a well, which became known as Jacob's well. In fact, there is an elaborate tomb that was constructed over the site where Joseph is buried, and absolutely no historian or scholar doubts that Joseph is buried under it. This is one of the most absolutely fixed places in all of biblical history. It still exists. The tomb, the elaborate tomb, and it sits about 100 yards away from Jacob's well. The site was venerated and considered sacred by both Jews and Samaritans. Joseph had delivered Israel and his sons from famine and sure death in the land of Canaan. But Joseph was also a type, an Old Testament picture of the true deliverer, promised by God, who would deliver the whole world from the spiritual famine that every man is dying from: sin. And it is on this spot, in the shadow of the tomb of one of Israel's greatest and most venerated deliverers, that for the very first time Jesus will declare, I am He. I am the Messiah, the very person that Joseph pointed to. And as if that were not enough, there's bonus material. And the reason I picked this map, because it so awesomely shows it. The geographical location of this field and well also holds great significance. The well lies in a valley between two mountains. And I sort of blew the punchline earlier. These two mountains are Ebal and Gerizim. So what is significant about that? We're going to jump way back to Deuteronomy 11, 26 through 29. Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I commanded you today to go after other gods, which you have not known. Now it shall be, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land which you go to possess, that you shall put the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Deuteronomy 27, 9 through 14. Then Moses and the priests, the Levites, spoke to all Israel, saying, Take heed and listen, O Israel. This day you have become the people of the Lord your God. Therefore you shall obey the voice of the Lord your God and observe his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. And Moses commanded the people on that same day, saying, These shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people when you have crossed over the Jordan: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. And these shall stand on Mount Ebal to curse: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. And the Levites shall speak with a loud voice and say to all the men of Israel. And the rest of chapter 27 and all the way through chapter 28, back and forth. If you do this, you're cursed. If you do this, you're cursed. If you do this, you're cursed. If you do this, you're blessed. If you do this, and back and forth for 2 whole chapters, and they're big chapters, of blessings and curses. And they did it. Joshua 8, 30 through 35. Now Joshua built an altar to the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones over which no man has wielded any iron. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there, in the presence of the children of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. Then all Israel, with their elders and officers and judges, stood on either side of the ark before the priests, the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as he who was born among them. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded before, that they should bless the people of Israel. And afterward he read the words of the law, the blessings and the cursing, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel. with the women, the little ones, and the strangers who were dwelling among them. Jacob's well is situated at the base of Mount Gerizim in the valley between Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Jesus is standing at the base of the Mount of Blessing in the Promised Land. He's standing in the very spot where the children of Israel heard the blessings of God pronounced over them. Blessings that they never got because they never really held up their end of the covenant. God would not be thwarted in his desire to save his people. He had made a way to save them despite their failure. The true deliverer, the true Joseph, now stood at the base of the Mount of Blessing to declare that he would absorb the curses of Ebal so that the blessings of Gerizim could finally be poured out on all who simply believe in his name. Yeshua, Jesus needed to go through Samaria. At least two reasons. To show and declare himself the greater than Joseph, the true deliverer of the people in the very shadow of Joseph's shrine. They venerated Joseph. He was, if it wasn't idol worship, it was awfully close. And like Jesus does so many times, where he faces false religions and false beliefs and idol worship, it's I'm the greater. What your God can't do, I can. And it was also to have an intimate conversation with a sinful, broken, and marginalized woman, which would lead her and an entire town being delivered from the curse of following false religion and idol worship through believing in the true deliverer, Jesus the Christ. Next week, we will dig into that conversation. Jesus kept every dot and tittle of the law. He deserved all of the blessings of Mount Gerizim. But instead, he went to the cross and absorbed all of the curses of Mount Ebal, the curses that we deserve. He vindicated God's righteousness and made a way for all of the blessings of Gerizim to be poured out on us. And this just kind of came to me. We focus on, we get the blessings now, we find. But Jesus also made it possible for his Father to be able to give the blessings. Do you know how long God's been waiting to bless his people? Really wanting to pour him. He is love. He's been wanting to bless. It wasn't just that we had to wait 5,000 years, 4,000 years to get the blessing. God had to wait 5,000 years to be able to pour out the blessing. God had to wait too. He needed to go through Samaria. And next week, we'll look at the amazing conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well.